Hello everyone, this is Dr. Sam McGinnis. I'm going over the 100-year lifestyle talk that we had last Tuesday the 26th over at Benvenuto's. We had a wonderful time. If you guys want to catch these in the future, this one we're putting on our Facebook page because we were planning on having this also available on Thursday the 21st of November, but that ended up getting canceled. So I'm making a video here for you guys so that everyone that missed that could see what we're talking about. So this is a very important topic. This affects a lot of people, and I just want to talk about one thing in particular regarding dementia and Alzheimer's, because dementia and Alzheimer's get linked together a lot of times, and they're technically different. Dementia is a general term used to describe a lot of different mental conditions that involve degeneration of the brain, where Alzheimer's specifically is due to memory loss. Dementia covers memory loss too as well, but Alzheimer's is very unique in its approach to attacking the hippocampus of the brain. So it's a little bit more, you can't diagnose Alzheimer's unless you do a biopsy of the brain or dissect the brain. So it's not something that we slap on things. It's a lot easier to say, oh, they have dementia, because that covers pretty much everything. And you can't get a confirmed Alzheimer's diagnosis until you do a biopsy on the brain after they die. So just the clarification there, dementia affects 50 million people in the United States. I should say affects. 50 million people in the United States have dementia. It affects many, many more people because, when you have one person that has dementia, and anyone who has parents or even children who have dementia, understand that affects the whole family. It's a pretty significant area. It has a pretty significant area of influence around who it affects. 10 million new cases each year, and rising. Actually, the number of cases are rising. It is currently an incurable disease. There is no cure. 1 in $5 spent by Medicare is spent on treating or taking care of patients with dementia, and that will rise in the future too as well, because the disease prevalence is rising. So what exactly is dementia? What exactly is Alzheimer's? And basically it depends on which area of the brain degenerates. Basically, dementia is a brain degenerative disease. The nerve cells die. So when the nerve cells die, you lose control of your body, you lose control of your mind, you lose control of your memory. A lot of this happens in the hippocampus, which is where Alzheimer's starts or takes place, and then spreads to the rest of the brain. So what is exactly happening? That's a great question, actually. A lot of research is trying to figure that out. But for the most part, the process is a degeneration of the brain, especially the nerve synapses, which we'll go into detail later on. This causes dementia and related memory loss diseases. And these are, like I said, relatively unknown on exactly what causes them and exactly what could be due to cure them, so to speak. As we get further into the talk, we're going to talk about some different strategies. What our current research has shown is that there's a lot of patterns associated. There's a lot of things that you can do that increases your risk. There's things that you can do to decrease your risk significantly. And what it boils down to is lifestyle. Who would have thought, right? But a lot of it boils down to your lifestyle, how you're living your life. And that increases or decreases your risk to basically degenerating your brain or having your brain go through a degenerative process. So your brain is composed of trillions and trillions of nerves. And these nerves, and this is a picture of a nerve, have synapses. I don't think you can see my mouse, but the synapses are over, if you look at the nerve cell, it's kind of whited out a little bit. They're at the very end of the little spirally hand things. And for lack of a better term, spirally hand things. So you have your nucleus, your cell body, your dendrites come out of the cell body, and your axon, which is the long tentacle, so to speak, will hook up into another nerve cell, and they communicate through the axon, and the communication space is the synapse. Now, this is my very expensive drawing that took me a long time to create, as you can see, on a nerve synapse. But basically, you have on one end a looks like kind of like a femur head, a presynaptic nerve ending, and you have a postsynaptic nerve ending, which looks kind of like a glove, so to speak, like a man holding a glove. And then those blue dots would signify neurotransmitters, and those are the communication, basically communication molecules that your body uses to communicate. You have many, many different types of neurotransmitters. They're used for different scenarios or different circumstances, and that creates communication between the nerve. They travel instantaneously, almost instantaneously across that little gap, which is the synaptic gap. I zoomed up. This is very, very small, but this is micrometers in between these two post and presynaptic clefts. And then we have something called amyloid beta, which is basically a byproduct. It's a protein, a byproduct of the metabolic processes that happen in the synaptic complex. We'll say this whole little synaptic complex between the presynaptic nerve ending and the postsynaptic nerve ending. And you have microglia. These are the ones that we're going to kind of focus in on. Microglia is the cleanup crew. It's the janitor of the synapse. So its job is to clear away the byproducts of the metabolic process, which it would be like amyloid beta. And that's kind of like a general, very, very, very basic view. Now, the current theory, and a lot of researchers would agree on this, for what happens during dementia, what happens during Alzheimer's, is that there is an increase, for some reason, there is an increase in amyloid beta at the nerve synapses. And this increase is at a rate faster than the microglia can clean it up. And what ends up happening is it clogs the synapse. This causes an inflammatory reaction from the microglia, which are part of the immune system, and they release harsh chemistry and try to break down and attack the amyloid beta molecules. And this process destroys the nerve synapse. This leads to a negative brain cascade or negative nerve cascade where tau proteins that are in the synapse change. They become damaged due to the increased inflammation levels that are in the nerve synapse, and they change into tangles, which is a generic term used to describe these tau proteins that become stretched and twisted to the point where they're useless. They can't be broken down and they can't be used, and so they accumulate inside the cell, which strangles it basically from the inside out and leads to cell death. Now, if you look back earlier in the slides, if you're above the age of 40, then most likely you already have a buildup of amyloid beta, the red protein, so to speak, the red dot, in your synaptic cleft, in your synapses, in your brain. But their research shows that having this here doesn't mean you will have symptoms of dementia. There is what they call a point of no return, or basically the tipping point. And the best analogy would be if you're holding a match that's lit on fire. That's not really that big of a deal. But if you light the match to the ground and it lights the forest on fire, that will build and build and build and consume the entire forest. That's much worse. So there's this tipping point at which the balance between how much your microglia can clear away the amyloid beta in your synapses versus the point where you get to this stage and it's all-out war, which will eventually kill the cell. uncontrolled cell death within the brain will lead to dementia and Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's. So how do we prevent this cascade? A lot of current treatments have been focused on trying to help people when they have dementia, when they're involved in that brain cascade, negative brain cascade, and they're largely unsuccessful. Some of the most modern medicines have only shown to reduce symptoms for about 6 to 8 months. So it's relatively ineffective. So prevention seems to be the best alternative currently. If you light that match, going back to the forest and match analogy, if you light that match, it's much easier to blow the match out than it is to try to stop the forest fire. And some would argue at this point it is impossible to stop the forest fire because we have been unsuccessful in stopping the symptoms or completely eliminating the symptoms once dementia has started. And like I said, only the modern medicines have been shown to reduce it for a max of 6 to 8 months. So how does this amyloid beta, how does this waste product or byproduct of nerve cell metabolism by the synapse get out of control? And that's a really big question. And this is where a lot of the research has looked at risk factors for this buildup and what we can do to stop it. And basically it comes down to age, sleeping habits, family history, activity level, gut health, and education level. And education level is very interesting, and we'll save that for last because whenever you're trying to keep interest in the audience, you want to save your best for last. But we're going to start with some of the things that a lot of you are probably well aware of. Age. Age has definitely a correlation with brain degenerative diseases. The average person over the age of 40 already has started an accumulation of amyloid plaques, and we've talked about this earlier. And that's something it's not that you're guaranteed to get Alzheimer's if you have amyloid plaques. It's just it's a fact. You're starting to accumulate these already when you're 40. After the age of 65, the risk for dementia doubles every 5 years. So when you get to 20% to 50% of all 85-year-olds in the world have dementia, that's kind of where you're starting to see a large portion of your dementia people is when you get to 85. Now there are people that have dementia that are younger than 65, but when you start seeing growing populations, that's going to be in your 85, that range between that 75, 85 years old. Another thing to consider too, you look at the percentage, 25 to 50%, and that has to do with the different studies that these are taken from. Some studies say 25%, some studies say 50%, so no one's wrong, they throw 25 to 50%. It's kind of a large percentile, which kind of is, whatever, but not very specific if you ask me, but that's what it is. If you're wondering why it's such a large sample between 25 and 50%. Another thing to consider too is because the largest growing demographic in the United States is centenarians, people that live to be 100 years old, we are seeing an increase in dementia cases, not just because people are living to be 100 years old, but we are seeing an increase in dementia cases in general because people are living to be older and they're not taking care of themselves, as you can see later on. We'll look into that, but they're developing dementia and it's costing the Medicare system more and more money. Not that it's their fault, it's not their fault, but it's something to consider that when we get these life-altering diseases, that it affects the people around us too as well. So it's not a guilt trip because it's sometimes it's out of our control, but as we'll go into, a lot of times it's not. And if we can take the steps now to prevent this, we can save our communities and our country and our fellow and our family a lot of trouble. Sleep. So sleep has been directly related. This has actually been relatively recent research directly related to your risk factors for dementia. Pretty significantly, actually. When you deep sleep, your glia cells, which we're talking about, your microglia, your glia is just another form of that. And our brains are able to clear away a lot of metabolic waste, a lot more than when you're awake. And this has been described as the deep sleep, but this sleep occurs during the deepest sleep phases of your sleep cycle. So you have phase 1, 2, 3, 4 in REM. And during your REM and stage 4 sleep cycles, this is where a lot of your deep sleep is taking place. So your 20-minute cap naps, or you're getting an hour here, or trying to make up for your 4 hours of sleep at night by taking a nap later on, is not going to have the same effects as getting a good solid 7 hours of sleep. Now, there is a catch-22 to this. Because amyloid accumulation, amyloid plaques, have been shown to disrupt sleep. And this is a positive feedback loop. So you have these amyloid plaques that are affecting your sleep, making you sleep less, and then they accumulate more when you don't sleep as much, because that cleaning cycle happens when you sleep. The glia cleaning cycle happens when you do your deep sleep. So it's important. This is actually something for if there's any college students listening to this, and early 30s, that getting your sleep then is going to be just as important, if not more important, than when you're older, because trying to establish those good sleep habits, and they call it sleep hygiene, is going to lead to better brain health further down when you're in 50s and 60s. And now sometimes it's hard to look that far in the future. It's hard to be like, well, my situation right now is that the baby is not feeling very well, and I have a test coming up, and different things like that. But I would challenge you to look at your life, and look at your life habits, and look at, okay, maybe staying up to midnight watching that movie consistently on Friday nights, or binge watching Netflix when I have a child, is not going to be best for my brain further down the future. It'd probably be better if I focus on getting to bed at a reasonable time. And I don't want to be someone's parent here, because we're all responsible adults, but sleep is a very significant factor. I mean, a single night of sleep deprivation can lead to an increase in amyloid beta at the brain synapses. So it's just one night of sleep deprivation, which is between your 5 and 4 hour range. It depends on each person, but between your 5 to 4 hour range of sleep, you're not getting nearly enough. They can look inside your brain and see already an increase in plaques. Now your glia cells can clean that away, and you can reset if you catch up on your sleep, and if you are doing other things right in your life, eating a healthier diet and different things like that. But it's playing catch up instead of trying to maintain. And there's a difference between trying to maintain, which your body is good at doing, and playing catch up, which is a lot more stressful on your body. So enough on that rant. Family history. Now, this is something that a lot of people and a lot of research, or not research, but a lot of scientists and doctors in the past have been like, family history, family history. You're going to have a much higher risk of dementia if your parents have it. But that is not necessarily as much of a factor as we originally had thought. Having a family member with dementia does increase your risk, but very little. And so there was one study where they studied 297 people who had two parents that were clinically diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so they compared them to, they followed their lives, and they compared them to the general population averages for dementia. And what they found is that those people that had two parents that were clinically diagnosed with Alzheimer's had a 22% risk of developing Alzheimer's themselves. But the general population has between a 6 and 13%. So if you look, it's not that much different than general population. So what we're saying is that family history doesn't play as much of a factor in developing Alzheimer's or dementia. They're kind of interchangeable at this point, but it doesn't have as much of an effect. And that's good news, because family history, like age, family history is out of our control. So we can concentrate on things that are in our control and hope for the best. I mean, it really comes down to changing our lifestyle, doing what we can, and leaving the rest up to God, for lack of a better term. that's what it ends up being. So you can decrease your risk of Alzheimer's by 50% with consistent aerobic activities. Now, aerobic activity is going to be things that um, require a lot of breathing. That's the best way I can think of describing it. So running, biking, anything where it requires a lot of breathing, that's very important. And that leads into our next topic, which is activity level. And so cardiovascular disease, such as diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, are all very significant risk factors. As a matter of fact, there was one study where where autopsies were done on patients with dementia, and they found that as many as 80% of all these patients that had dementia also had cardiovascular problems too as well. And that just kind of makes sense, right? If we're talking about a brain degenerative disease, we're talking about your neurons, which have some of the highest oxygen demand. It's one of the highest oxygen demanding tissues in your body. If you don't have oxygen in your brain dies within 20 minutes. Versus other areas of your body can survive hours and hours, if not days, without direct oxygen flow. So it makes sense that if you're exercising, you're going to increase your blood oxygen levels. You're going to increase your cardiovascular efficiency. And that will give your brain a better advantage at not degenerating. It just makes sense. It's common sense. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's pretty straightforward. It's interesting to note that it's aerobic exercise, it's not anaerobic. Anaerobic is like you're lifting weights. Aerobic is like you're running. So keep that in mind. It's more tied to your exercises, like I said, that you're breathing hard, that you're sweating. That's important. Gut health. This is also interesting. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is very interesting. We talked a lot about gut health at our talks because it's so very important. There is a chemical that is produced inside of your gut. It's called brain-derived neurotropic factor, and this is, if you want to look, you can look up research on this yourself. But it's super interesting. It's really starting to understand it a little bit better. It's plays a huge factor in basically brain health. Long-term potency or potentiality of the brain to restore memory, and helps form synaptic plasticity, which is part of your brain plasticity. So it allows your body to create new memories, to change, and to create stronger connections between memories. So it's very significant. There was a couple different studies, or there was one study in particular where they basically took this chemical out of mice. So it was, and when you have sterile mice, we don't see a whole lot of this chemical to begin with, because a lot of it's produced in the gut. And they noticed that the mice's memories, when they were presented with tasks that they performed, and then when they presented with the same task, normal mice would be able to perform that task that they performed before relatively easily because they have memory. These mice did not. They were unable to perform those tasks because their memory was so terrible. So this is very significant, and this plays a role with your gut health. Gut health is when we talk about prebiotics, probiotics, and inflammation, those are going to be your biggest components. You want to eat things that are fermented and have fiber in them. That's going to be your prebiotic. Your probiotic is going to be consuming things with bacteria. A lot of times we have to consume probiotic supplements in order to get the levels of bacteria that are efficient and beneficial for our body. And then we're looking at inflammation, reducing food sensitivities, inflammatory foods, and different things like that. And a lot of times we can find out what those foods are for each person individually through blood testing. And that's something we do at our office. It's something that I highly encourage you. If you haven't had your blood tested for food sensitivities, to do that, because that can lead you into insight in how to avoid inflammatory situations in your gut. And that's going to play a big role with not just your brain health, but everything else, virtually everything else in your body. So what if you have every risk factor? What if you've been what if you didn't sleep during college and you had 8 kids and you didn't sleep much during your uh, during the kid years, and then now you've gotten older and you only sleep a couple hours at night. You had two parents that had dementia or in Alzheimer's. You've been the only time you get up and run is when someone's chasing you, and your couch is your favorite hobby, sitting on the couch, and all these different risk factors. Um, you are prime candidate to develop dementia. Your risk is through the roof. What do you do? Because there is things that you can do even when you have all those risk factors. Even when the match, if we go back to our earlier analogy, even when our match has literally hit the floor and is burning the forest down, what do we do? Well, there was a study on nuns, so on Catholic nuns, and this nun study showed it ended up being 678 nuns when it was all done, and it followed their lifestyle. And they donated their brains to be studied after they died. And a lot of what they were looking for was dementia and degenerative brain diseases, because we have a population that lives similar lifestyles. They have a similar environment. They're all female, and so it makes a really good study group. You reduce a lot of your variables. Now, they noted though that some of the healthy nuns' brains had increased levels of amyloid betas, that protein we're talking about around the synapses. They had all this amyloid beta plaquing, brain shrinkage, protein tangles. We talked about the tau proteins turning into tangles when they get destroyed. But none of these nuns exhibited symptoms of dementia. I should say these nuns. So there were some nuns that developed dementia later in life in the study, but there was healthy nuns that when they looked at their brains, they saw all this damage, but they still were able to function and have none of the symptoms of dementia, be sharp as a tack. And what they concluded was these nuns had much higher neuroplasticity and cognitive reserve. And we're going to get into those two concepts here, but that makes a big difference on how much neuroplasticity and cognitive reserve that you can have will determine your ability for your brain to adapt to the damage that's caused by these amyloid beta plaquing. So this is where we look into education and learning. Some people talk about the brain being a muscle, and you have to flex it, or not flex it, but you have to, that's not the same thing. You have to strengthen it. And there is a lot of truth in that. It's not quite the same thing. It's obviously not a muscle, but it is strengthened. It is developed. Neuroplasticity, in the simplest terms, is the process of gaining and losing synapses, non-pathologically. So this is a normal process in your brain. Your brain changes. Things that it doesn't need to remember anymore, it erases. And things that it needs to remember, or things that it needs to make a strong connection to, it builds more synapses to. And that is directly proportional to how you use your brain. For instance, if I look at a book and I read it, I will create memory of reading that book. Now, the memory of reading that book will be, well, actually, a book is that's not a really great example because it's really strong. The memory will be reading it. If I read it out loud, it'll be talking about it. I'll be feeling the book with my hands. If the book is funny, I'll laugh. I'll have an emotional response. All these things are connecting different parts of the brain, and they're creating synapses that will create a stronger memory, so to speak. Now, let's say I read that book again. Boom. We have now reinforced all those synapses again, and that creates stronger connections. Let's say I read a similar book. Now it ties that book to the previous memories of the past book that I've read, and you've created even more stronger connections. So that's neuroplasticity, basically. If I was to watch a movie, similar things happen, but it's not the same level because there might not be as much mental engagement, or if I'm reading a book, I'm thinking more about it, there's more mental engagement, I'm creating more synapses. If I'm passively watching a movie, I'm not as actively engaged, and so I'm just kind of absorbing the information instead of creating the information in my mind. So cognitive reserve is another thing too, and that's basically boiled down to a nutshell, how many nerve connections you have for